Hello. In this video, we're going to discuss the establishment of the New England colonies, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and the southern or deep southern colonies, not including Virginia. I'll discuss some important similarities and differences between all of these colonies. And what you'll find is that in many ways, these colonies are more different than they are similar. They may speak English, they may have similar patterns of land use, but um, local and regional issues and then migration patterns affect how these colonies are established, particularly in the mid-Atlantic, where there's a large non-English population. And I'm going to explain what that looks like in this video. I'm also going to discuss some additional conditions back in the British Isles that have a major impact on the migration patterns and on the people that go from the British Isles to the English colonies and then where in the colonies they go. I want to add some additional clarification about the differences in the types of English and eventually British colonies as England becomes Great Britain after 1707 with the union of England and Scotland. And the types of colonies, charter/corporate colonies, proprietary colonies, and royal colonies, they are significant because they're a reflection of the growth of the English Empire and then eventually the British Empire and the increasing centralization of the English and eventually British Empire. Because remember, in the beginning, the English colonies are very decentralized, unlike, say, the Spanish, who had a very centralized empire from the beginning. The early colonies, places like Jamestown at Virginia and then Plymouth up in New England, they were charter or corporate colonies. And these colonies had a charter with the king, but they're funded and ruled by private companies who foot the bill for establishing the colony and then will rule with basically the blessing of the king. This doesn't mean, though, that all the colonists that go to these charter colonies like the king. In fact, the colonists of Plymouth, they may have the approval of the king to start a colony. They don't like the king very much. As time goes on, this corporate charter model is replaced by the proprietary and royal model, reflecting increased centralization of the empire. Proprietary colonies are funded by wealthy individuals who have gained some kind of favor or support from the king. And there's many examples of proprietary colonies. Maryland is an early example of a proprietary colony founded by the Calvert family or Lord Baltimore. They'd gained approval from King Charles I to start a Catholic colony or a Catholic safe haven for English Catholics who were often persecuted back in England itself. Pennsylvania also was a proprietary colony founded by the Penn family. The Penn family had gained favor from the king. And so they go on to set up a safe haven for Quakers in Pennsylvania. Things can get a bit confusing because sometimes a colony goes from being proprietary to royal. Again, proprietary to royal, wealthy family to being then taken over by the king. This reflects increasing centralization. Also, some of the non-English colonies that are taken over by the English, they start out as proprietary colonies when the English immediately take over, often becoming royal or becoming more centralized with time. There were some colonies that sort of came in as royal from the beginning, and the most notable example would be South Carolina and North Carolina. Technically, they came in as one proprietary colony, but when they split up, they came in as royal colonies in the late 1720s, again, reflecting increased centralization. So what you really want to know for this class is that the early colonies are very decentralized, as shown by the investor-funded charter corporate model. In the middle, you have the proprietary colonies, funded by wealthy families that had gained support from the king. And then towards the end, you have the more centralized royal colonies that kind of replace the charter and proprietary model. So think increasing centralization as time goes on. This is a map showing the region of New England. The red dots here show where the first English settlements were at Plymouth and then at Boston, and then the colonists spread further to the north and to the west. The colonists of Massachusetts Bay, they're going to claim control of the New Hampshire colony as well as the Maine colony, and eventually Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay are actually going to merge together into a single colony. You can also see on this map that these colonies are claiming territory out west, outside of what we would think of as New England. But now we're going to move and begin discussing the establishment of Plymouth Colony, the first colony in New England. On first examination, one might conclude that the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies were incredibly similar. Both colonies were established by English settlers. Both colonies were founded on the North American coast, and both colonies were set up not with money and direct involvement from the English government, but by private consortiums that were separate from the English state. Additionally, both the Jamestown and Plymouth colonists faced many of the same challenges during their settlement's early years. Both groups of colonists struggled to store up sufficient food resources, and both factions struggled to adapt their English life ways to survive in the North American environment. What I hope you'll see, however, is that the similarities between Jamestown and Plymouth end here. Although both colonies were English, the Englishmen and women who came to Plymouth did so for very different reasons than the Jamestown settlers. And the Plymouth colonists went about building their colony in a very different way as well. While some scholars may disagree, I would argue that Jamestown and Plymouth were more different than they were similar. In order to understand why Plymouth was so different from Jamestown, we have to talk a little bit about who the people were that established Plymouth, the so-called Pilgrims. Back in England, the people who formed the Pilgrims' political leadership and cultural elite were religious dissidents called separatists. Like another group of dissidents called the Puritans, the separatists thought the Church of England was too showy, and it operated too much like the Catholic Church, both practically and theologically. While the Puritans wanted to stay in England and purify the Anglican Church, hence their name, the separatists wanted to leave and found their own churches and communities. I want to quickly provide a bit more background about the people who become the Pilgrims and the Puritans, because theologically and culturally, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were very similar. They had very similar theological beliefs. They lived their lives in a very similar way. It's just the separatists who became the Pilgrims, they had had enough of the English king and the Church of England earlier, and they left sooner than the Puritans did. So this Puritan separatist group, they're of the middle professional educated classes. This professional middle educated class, they were also the first people, incidentally, to become Protestant in England. And really, you could think of the Puritans and the separatists or the Pilgrims as being kind of the most Protestant of all of the English people in terms of their rejection of ritualism, Catholic-style ritualism, their focus on having their own religious system that's different than others. They're kind of the most Protestant of all the Protestants, you might say. Generally, the Puritans and the people who eventually become the Pilgrims or the Separatists, they live in the eastern part of England, especially the southeast. Some of the people who become Pilgrims or Separatists, they're a little bit further to the north, but they're still on the east side of England. And this is the most well-connected and most developed part of the British Isles at this point. There's a lot of business connections with the European continent, in particular on the eastern part of England. So it's exactly where you would be if you're a educated, professional, middle-class person. They want to purify the Church of England, hence their name. The Separatists, though, they get fed up sooner and they want to be separate sooner than the rest of the Puritans. As far as the way they dress, they were called the sad colors, S-A-D-D. They're not really sad in the emotional sense. They're simple, plain colors, usually darker colors, dark brown, dark green, dark brownish red, even a dark purple. The idea is these colors, they will not fade. They're inexpensive, they're practical, they're easy to clean, and you don't draw too much attention to yourself. Contrary to popular belief, the Pilgrims and the Puritans did not just wear black all the time. They wore different types of colors. In fact, if you wore black all the time as a Pilgrim or as a Puritan, that was professional attire. That was what you wore on Sunday to look your best. That was what professionals like doctors and lawyers and church ministers wore. If you just wore black in the middle of the week, they actually would think that that was a little bit pretentious, like you were putting on airs. And because of their refusal to join the Church of England, because they lived differently, they're persecuted by King James I. Their leaders are going to be imprisoned. They're going to be shamed publicly, dragged through the streets. They're going to have their churches shut down. And some, the Puritans, will stick around for longer and try to fix things back in England. Others, like the separatists, are going to elect to leave England much sooner to try to set up their own society. They're going to try it first in the Netherlands, and then they're eventually going to go to North America. Now we'll continue our discussion of the separatists who become the Pilgrims. Religious dissidents, like the Puritans and the separatists, had faced some censure during the Elizabethan years. But persecution increased under Elizabeth's successor, James I, who imprisoned dissidents and shut down their churches. The separatist congregation in Scrooby, northeast England, about 200 miles from London, was raided by Anglican authorities in 1607, the same year that Jamestown was founded. This increased persecution motivated the separatists to leave England, sailing to the Netherlands in 1608. The separatists left their homeland for religious reasons, hence they are called Pilgrims today. They did not call themselves Pilgrims. Instead, they tended to refer to themselves as saints or planters once they had reached America. This map of England shows where the New England settlers primarily came from. Areas in dark brown have the highest number of families that went to New England. As you can see, the southeast, it is the most brown region. This is where the highest number of Puritan people who were going to New England were coming from. If you look a bit to the north, there's still quite a bit of brown. That's getting close to Scrooby, where the separatists or Pilgrims were from. So you can see this is primarily an East Anglian group of people. They're coming from the eastern parts of England. There are some from the southeast as well, but it's mostly from the east and mostly from the southeast is where this group of people are going to be coming from primarily. But we're going to continue our discussion of the separatists and where they go now. As discussed in a previous video, the Dutch were the most tolerant and religiously permissive of all European powers, welcoming Christians of all sects into their country. The Pilgrims sailed to Amsterdam, but settled in Leiden, a much smaller town, with a slower pace allowed them to live more like they had back in England. While the pluralism of the Netherlands was a pull factor that led the Pilgrims to come to Holland, they quickly found that Dutch society was too pluralistic, and their children were losing their English Pilgrim heritage, becoming acculturated to the Dutch culture. The Pilgrims also feared that James I might send agents to Holland to arrest their leaders as well. All of these factors, the worldliness of Dutch society, the assimilation of their young people, and the fears of renewed English persecution would become push factors that would inspire the Pilgrims to leave the Netherlands and sail to the Americas. The Pilgrim leadership decided that the best way to avoid persecution and safeguard the next generation from the temptations of the world was to leave Europe and establish a colony in the Americas. To this end, the Pilgrims purchased a sailing vessel, the Speedwell, in the Netherlands, and another larger ship, the Mayflower, in England. The Pilgrims briefly stopped in southern England to take on more separatists who had been unable to go to the Netherlands. They also took on another group of colonists called the Strangers. The Strangers had not been affiliated with any separatist congregation, but were permitted to travel to America to help build the colony. While most of the Pilgrims' leadership was separatists, some of the strangers, like Stephen Hawkins and Miles Standish, would become important leaders in the Pilgrim colony. Many of the strangers were indentured servants as well, who would have to labor in order to gain their freedom and become full members of the colony. Of the 150 Pilgrim colonists, over 100 were strangers and about 50 were saints from established separatist congregations. During the passage, the Speedwell sprung a leak and had to return to England, and the Mayflower nearly sank after its main mast cracked during a gale. The Pilgrims used the screw from their printing press to help keep the mast together for the rest of the journey, using the screw a lot like a modern-day car jack to hold the mast together, as seen in the image at the top right. The Pilgrims had brought a printing press to the Americas because, in the tradition of the Reformation, they believed a literate, well-read, and educated populace was the key to establishing a successful Christian society. After a difficult journey across the Atlantic, the Mayflower reached America in November of 1620, off the coast of Cape Cod. The Pilgrims had planned on establishing their colony further to the south in the Hudson River Valley, in what is now New York, but they had been blown off course by the storms. It was too late in the season to sail to the Hudson, so, with winter setting in, the Pilgrims decided to build their colony where they had landed. They commemorated their landing at Plymouth Rock. The Pilgrims were not the first Europeans to explore Cape Cod and what would become Massachusetts. The Spanish, the French, and even the English, under John Smith, whom we discussed before, had sailed around the Cape and fished off its shores. I mentioned earlier European explorations because it will be important later. The Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact in November of 1620. They needed to draft this legal document to demonstrate the colony's legality because they had set up their colony, or they'd begun to set up their colony in Massachusetts further to the north than the agreed upon location that they had established with the king. So they wanted to prove the colony's legality and its loyalty. You'll notice as they drafted the document, it was written primarily by William Bradford and William Brewster, important early Pilgrim leaders. They refer to the king as the dread sovereign. They're doing this because they're showing respect. He's powerful, but they don't like him very much. He's the dread sovereign, not the magnificent, not the glorious sovereign. And they're also drafting it in the name of God as well. So this document, though, is significant. It is significant for several reasons. It's written by the colonists themselves, and then it's signed by all of the adult male colonists, basically the people that become the citizens. The women don't become citizens, the children and unfree people don't become citizens, but the free adult males are all citizens. They all have their input in this document. And the Mayflower Compact promises self-government. It promises rule of law, that the citizens will abide by the rules of the colony, and it says that there are certain responsibilities but rights that citizens will have. So it's a very important founding document. You'll definitely want to know about it for the Florida Civic Literacy exam if you're a Florida college student. And it's recognized that the Mayflower Compact will go on to inspire later American documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And now we'll continue our analysis of the founding of the Plymouth colony. A few of the colonists disembarked from the Mayflower to explore Massachusetts and begin building a meeting house, a church that would double as a town hall and a fortified outpost. Miles Standish, a soldier and a stranger, led an exploratory patrol into the interior and found an abandoned Native American settlement. It had once belonged to the Patuxet people. Standish and his men also disturbed a Patuxet grave as well, recovering some Indian corn, which they brought back to the Mayflower. This Patuxet village would become the site where the first Plymouth colony was built. Most of the colony's women and children spent the winter of 1620 aboard the Mayflower, where Peregrine White, the first pilgrim born in America, came into this world. This was a major difference between the Plymouth and Jamestown colony. The Jamestown colony was established with only male colonists, while Plymouth had female settlers from the beginning. This difference was driven by the fact that the first Jamestown colonists came to the New World for economic factors, the finding of gold, the acquisition of land, or to pay off an indenture. The Plymouth colonists, at least the original separatists, came to America for religious reasons, and a desire to establish a community based on their spiritual principles. For this, they needed to bring their wives, mothers, and daughters with them to the New World. The colonists continued to work on the Plymouth settlement, building their new outpost on the location of the abandoned Patuxet settlement. Scholars think the Patuxet people abandoned their settlement due to disease that had been unwittingly introduced by the European traders and sailors that we discussed previously. The colonists chose to name their new settlement Plymouth after the city of Plymouth in Devon, southern England. The male colonists continued to construct the settlement's buildings and practice military drills throughout the winter of 1620 and early 1621. Despite their efforts, nearly half of the Pilgrims died of diseases during the first winter, cooped up on the Mayflower and confined to the settlement's communal meeting house. In March of 1621, the Pilgrims had contact with Native Americans. They met Samoset of the Abenaki tribe. Samoset greeted the colonists in English, having learned the language from English traders. They also met Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag people, the dominant Native American power in coastal Massachusetts. Most importantly, they met an Indian named Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, who was the sole survivor of the Patuxet people. Squanto also knew English and was familiar with European lifeways, having visited England. He was also captured and enslaved by Spanish sailors and had spent time in Spain as well. John Carver, Plymouth's first governor, made a peace treaty with Massasoit. Both sides agreed not to attack each other, and both groups signed a mutual defensive pact, meaning that each signatory would come to the aid of the other in times of war. The Plymouth colonists' relations with Native Americans, at least early on, stood in stark contrast to how the English colonists of Jamestown treated the indigenous people of Virginia. The Plymouth colonists wanted to have peace and did not wish to press the Indians to serve them or provide them with food and labor, as the Jamestown colonists had done. Consequently, while Jamestown fought intermittent wars with Native Americans in its early years, the Plymouth colonists would live peaceably with the indigenous people of Cape Cod in eastern Massachusetts for over 50 years, although they would serve in other wars against Native Americans in other parts of North America. In the spring of 1621, the Pilgrims began to move into the Plymouth settlement, which they had taken to calling Plymouth Plantation. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to adapt their lifeways to the New England environment. In particular, he taught the Pilgrim farmers how to raise corn and other crops. In contrast to Virginia, New England's soil is rocky, hard to till, and has few nutrients. Squanto taught the Pilgrims to bury fish with their corn. The fish would decompose and impart nutrients to the soil as the corn grew. That summer, the colonists discovered that they had unwittingly stolen some corn from the Nauset people, after the Nausets detained one of their settlement's young men. Instead of going to war to rescue their colonists, the Plymouth settlers paid the Nausetts for the stolen corn, demonstrating their desire to live peacefully with Native Americans. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated a day of Thanksgiving, including prayers and feasts to thank God for the success of their colony, their ability to grow food in New England, and their peaceful relations with Native Americans. The feast was probably held in October, not November, when it has been celebrated since the U.S. Civil War. 53 surviving colonists and about 90 Wampanoag warriors, including Chief Massasoit, attended the event, once again highlighting the desire that the initial Pilgrim colonists had for living peacefully with Native Americans. This attitude would change over time with the arrival of new colonists and the establishment of additional English colonies in the region. Reminder, Plymouth was founded in the winter of 1620, and Massachusetts Bay was founded in the spring of 1630, so about 10 years later. The people that founded Plymouth, the Pilgrims or the Separatists, they had very similar theological views to the Puritans, and in fact many historians kind of lump them together as a single cultural group, even if the Separatists came over first, having been frustrated with the English government and the Church of England earlier than the Puritans were, who tried to stick around a little bit longer to purify and reform things back in England. But the left image is the flag of New England. It features the English flag in its top left corner. The center image is the seal of New England. It says New England in Latin. If you look closely, you can see in the center of the seal a Native American saying, "Come over and help us." This is a biblical reference. It's a reference to the Bible when St. Paul first brought Christianity to Europe, to Greece, from Asia Minor and from the Middle East. He had a vision in which someone from Europe, from Greece, said, "Come over and help us." So the Puritans were very into the biblical scriptures, and they believed that they were going to be helping Native Americans by establishing their own utopian society in North America. Of course, the Native Americans would have had a very different idea about the Puritans that began moving into Massachusetts. And the image on the right is of John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it gives you an idea of what the Puritans would have worn on special occasions or when they were sitting for their portrait. Black, which was the color professionals, and a fancy collar like that you wouldn't wear every single day. That would have been a bit too pretentious. But if you're having a nice picture of yourself made, then you would dress as professionally as possible. The next major English colony established in America was at Massachusetts Bay, just to the north of Cape Cod in the Plymouth settlement. This new settlement would also be founded by religious dissidents, the Puritans, whom we discussed before. The Puritans began sailing to Massachusetts in 1630, led by John Winthrop, the colony's first governor. Like Plymouth, the colony ruled itself in order to maintain its religious and cultural beliefs. The Massachusetts Bay colonists established the settlement of Boston in September of 1630. Boston would grow in size and prestige and become one of the most important cities in English colonial America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony grew quickly, even more quickly than Plymouth. During the Great Migration of the 1630s, Massachusetts Bay saw over 20,000 Puritans flee persecution in the British Isles to settle in the colony. Massachusetts Bay, like its predecessor, Plymouth, was patterned and ruled on religious principles. In the early days of the colony, the only people who could vote were male members of the Puritan Church. While this system might seem oppressive and intolerant today, denying women and non-Puritan men the right to vote, for the time it was remarkably egalitarian, allowing some everyday colonists the franchise and a say in the colony's political affairs. This political model would be duplicated in other Puritan settlements in the region, forming the town councils that are ubiquitous in present-day New England politics and culture. The colony's population would increase again during the 1640s as a result of civil wars in England, and more colonists, including many non-Puritans, began to come to Massachusetts Bay, changing much of the colony's original religious culture. The new colonists found the Puritan establishment's strict rules about church attendance, gender relations, and the consumption of goods to be oppressive. The new colonists chafed under these rules, threatening the colonial stability of Massachusetts. In response, the Puritan elite passed a series of laws that were meant to be a compromise between the new immigrants and the more religious founding colonists. The most important of these compromises was the Halfway Covenant of the 1660s. The Halfway Covenant allowed people who had not converted to Puritan Christianity to join the Puritan Church, and thus have political rights, so long as they allowed themselves to be baptized in the Puritan Church. I want to briefly discuss the English Civil War and how it impacted migration patterns to the English colonies, particularly to New England. A lot of Puritans went to New England after the establishment of Plymouth and of Massachusetts Bay. There was a lot of pull factors in New England: religious freedom, at least if you were a Puritan, economic opportunities, lots of different types of jobs, relative economic equality in New England, relative democracy, at least for Puritan males. Land was available to settlers. Push factors were the increasing persecution of Puritans and dissenting Protestants in England if you weren't a member of the Church of England. This takes place under King Charles I. You can see an image of him on this slide. This increased persecution of the Puritans will lead to the English Civil War, in which King Charles and the Royalists, their soldiers were known as Cavaliers. They were very aristocratic horsemen. They're going to fight against the Puritan parliamentarians and the Roundheads, who are going to be led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. And the Puritan soldiers were called the Roundheads because they wore helmets, and also because they supposedly had sort of a practical but rather unstylish haircut that looked a lot like a bowl cut, so they're called Roundheads. In the end, the Puritan parliamentarians win. They take over the country. They put Charles on trial. They accuse him of being a closet Catholic because he had been friendlier with Catholics. He married a Catholic French princess. He allowed the establishment of Catholic Maryland. And in the end, they execute him. And once the Puritans are in charge of England, they go from being the persecuted to the persecutors. They shut down theatrical productions and they begin to persecute non-Puritan people. Here are some modern historical reenactors dressed up as Roundheads and Cavaliers to illustrate their fashion choices, which are a reflection of their culture and a reflection of their political allegiance. The Cavaliers are very aristocratic, and you can see it in their fancy coats and their hats with feathers, whereas the Puritan Roundheads are not nearly as fancily dressed. They're dressed much more practically, with their helmets and their darker colors, their sad colors, really reflecting Puritan culture. So Puritan parliamentarian rule under Oliver Cromwell also impacts migration to the English colonies. Initially, Oliver Cromwell tried to dissolve the English monarchic tradition and take the colony in a less monarchist direction and a more parliamentarian direction. But over time, Cromwell basically became a dictator, and there was suppression of non-Puritan people and elements of the English culture that the Puritans did not like theatrical productions. Cromwell will also fight campaigns against the Irish and the Scottish and against any remaining royalist factions in England. Again, the persecuted became the persecutors once they took over. And this will actually lead to another great migration, really, of royalists. That is, people who were loyal to the now executed King Charles I. They're not going to go to New England, though. They're going to try to go to other places like Virginia or Maryland. The last place you'd want to go as a royalist is Massachusetts Bay. You'd be going out of the frying pan of England and into the fire of New England. One Puritan government that's persecuting you into another Puritan government that's not going to give you political rights. Pacifists who emerge from the English Civil War will eventually go on to Pennsylvania once it's founded, but Pennsylvania is founded in the 1680s. Some might even want to go to a place like New York and just get out of English territory altogether, although, of course, New York will eventually be taken over. Rather, it was a Dutch colony that was taken over by the English. This royalist migration, though, slows down after King Charles II takes over. Charles II was the son of Charles I, and he's often called the Merry Monarch because he was more religiously tolerant, and he restored some of the freedoms of expression that had been suppressed by Cromwell and his supporters. Also, Charles II lived a less moral life. He is rumored to have had multiple extramarital affairs and mistresses. His court, they focus on partying and having a good time. He acts a lot like a French monarch, really, in terms of how he lived his life. And some people suspected that Charles II was secretly Catholic, again, because, like his father, he was kinder to Catholics, and he tried to have closer relations with Catholic France. Charles II actually did convert to Catholicism on his deathbed, so maybe that was where his heart always was, but I don't think he was a Catholic secretly his entire life. Odd story, though, about Charles II. He's the Merry Monarch. He's more tolerant. He lives a looser lifestyle morally, but he was still very angry at Oliver Cromwell for what Cromwell did to his father. So he actually had Cromwell's body or remains exhumed and put on trial and then executed, even though he was already dead. Just interesting things that happen at this point in history. Before we continue our discussion of the New England colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut, I want to mention New Hampshire and Maine briefly. Not because they're unimportant, but I'm mentioning them here because they basically get taken over by Massachusetts Bay Colony. New Hampshire colonists began arriving in what would become New Hampshire in the 1620s, after the settlement of Plymouth, but before the settlement of Massachusetts Bay. And the settlements in New Hampshire in the beginning were more like a loose confederation of settlements rather than a single colony. For these colonists, they're a little bit different than other New England colonists. Commerce more than religion was their motivating factor, their push and pull factor to get them to America. There were opportunities in fishing and in logging and the fur trade that were available in New Hampshire and also in Maine as well. New Hampshire will eventually, though, be absorbed by Massachusetts Bay in 1641. Massachusetts Bay, they're pushing westward into Native American territory. They're also pushing northward into the territory of other English colonists. New Hampshire will break away in the 1680s. It will be absorbed again in the 1690s, and it will be completely independent as its own colony by the 1640s. So New Hampshire's kind of changing hands multiple times during this period. Generally speaking, there's more religious toleration and peaceful relations with Native Americans in New Hampshire during the periods in which they're not controlled by Massachusetts Bay. And the Native Americans we're talking about in New Hampshire are the Abenaki and Pennacock people. Maine, it's a similar story, set up more for commercial than religious reasons. But it's going to be taken over by Massachusetts Bay in the 1650s. Massachusetts Bay was very interested in Maine because, for economic reasons, there's things like the fur trade, there's logging, there's fishing up there, but also there's a desire to shore up control of Maine, bring a Puritan style of religion and governance to Maine, basically to make the Maine area a bulwark against the Catholic French in Canada and against other Native Americans, most notably the Wabanaki. And Maine is going to remain a part of New Hampshire, or kind of a province of New Hampshire, really until the 1820s. After the establishment of the United States of America, Maine will become a state on its own. But with that, we'll turn our attention to Connecticut and to Rhode Island, which remained independent from Massachusetts Bay and have some similarities, but some pretty big differences with Massachusetts Bay as well, as you're going to see. Other colonies established in New England were the colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut, both founded in 1636. Rhode Island was founded by the religious dissident Roger Williams. Williams was a Baptist and believed that only adults and older children should be baptized, in contrast to the Puritans, who preferred only to baptize infants and new converts. Williams also questioned the Puritans' legal authority to establish a colony in New England. The Puritan authorities viewed Williams' teachings as a threat to the colony's social cohesion, banishing Williams and his supporters from Massachusetts. In response, Williams and his followers established Providence in what would become Rhode Island. Rhode Island was intended to be a settlement where colonists could be free to practice Christianity as they saw fit. Williams also committed to trying to keep peace with Native Americans, so he and his colonists purchased land from Native Americans rather than claiming it for themselves, as had been done at Jamestown in Massachusetts Bay. In contrast to Rhode Island, which was founded by religious dissidents, Connecticut was established by Puritans who wanted to have more of a separation between church and state, in a model that was more like the Plymouth colony. Over time, however, the settlements that formed Connecticut became more like Massachusetts, instituting church membership and property requirements to allow colonists to vote. The Connecticut colonists also emphasized trade with England and the consumption of consumer goods to a much higher degree than their neighbors in Massachusetts. The New England colonies were initially politically and socially distinct, but they became more culturally similar over time. As is the case throughout world history, an armed conflict brought these colonies together in an unprecedented way during the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638. The conflict began as European colonists expanded their settlements in southern New England in order to cash in on the lucrative fur trade discussed previously. The Pequot tribe, which was living in southern New England at the time, began to side with the Dutch colonists in the Hudson River Valley, looking to make an alliance against the English settlers, who were encroaching on their communities. It should be noted, though, that the Mohegan people, who broke off from the Pequots, allied themselves with the English colonies in New England. The English colonies, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Plymouth, fought together against the Pequots. Rhode Island did not join the conflict, but it did convince the Narragansett people to join the English against the Pequots. The English and their Indian allies defeated the Pequots, fighting them with great ferocity, killing most of the Pequots at the Battle of Mystic Fort on May 26, 1637. The English and their native allies surrounded the Pequots' fortified settlement and set it on fire. The English and their allies killed most of the survivors of the fire, but the Narragansett and Mohegans were shocked at the brutal, decisive way in which the English fought their wars. Remember, the Native Americans of the Northeast were no strangers to warfare, but they did not believe in complete destruction of their enemies. The war basically destroyed the Pequot tribe, forcing its surviving members to join the Narragansetts, the Mohegans, or the Mohawk people further to the southwest. The Pequot War, though brief, was incredibly significant. First, it convinced the colonists of New England of the efficacy of joining together against a common foe, giving rise to the New England Confederation. Second, the war demonstrated that while Native Americans were critical allies for the Europeans, both groups tend to have very different war aims and rules of engagement. Before we move on to England's other colonies, we must discuss a few more of the commonalities between the English colonies in New England and how they differ from Jamestown, Virginia, England's first American colony. The New England colonies were established primarily for religious reasons, whereas the Jamestown colony in Virginia was established for economic motivations, first for the extraction of gold, and later the production of tobacco. The New England colonies were also meant to be more self-sufficient than Virginia, which was dependent on the tobacco trade with England. The New England colonial economy was more diverse than Jamestown's, exporting a variety of commodities like fur and dried fish back to England. New England also engaged in large-scale food crop agriculture to feed its colonists, in a way that Jamestown and Virginia did not. The New England colonies, unlike Jamestown, were more egalitarian as well, using religion, especially Puritanism, to give male colonists unprecedented political rights. Religion did not afford this kind of upward mobility in Virginia. On the issue of labor, the New England colonies had indentured servants and eventually African chattel slaves, but most of the colony's labor was completed by free colonists. Virginia, in contrast, was dependent on unfree labor from both indentured servants and later on enslaved Africans. The New England colonies would import indentured servants and slaves, but they would not have a significant impact on the society and culture of New England compared with the colonies further to the south. New England's environment, its colder climate, shorter growing seasons, and rocky, unfertile soil made cash crop agriculture less practical in the region. Thus, while New England was not able to quickly amass wealth through the growth of the brown gold of tobacco, it did not have to import nearly as many unfree laborers as Virginia did. New England's colder weather, while making agriculture more difficult, did have an upside, as it made water and mosquito-borne illnesses less common. Early on, New England's colonists had a higher life expectancy than the Virginia settlers, meaning that Virginia's population growth was dependent on immigration, while New England's population growth occurred through natural increase as well as immigration. Culturally speaking, the New England colonists, inspired by the principles of the Reformation, established education institutions in America. To this end, they founded schools for their children, where they learned language and mathematics from a religious perspective. These schools used lessons from the Bible to teach students basic knowledge, but also Christian moral precepts, as you can see in this slide here. New England's Puritans, as Protestant Christians, believed that humanity was innately sinful, and thus children had to be taught from a young age of their sin and the importance of resisting their own selfish urges in order to obey their parents, their political leaders, and God. New England school teachers often used harsh methods, from hours-long rote memorization sessions to corporal punishment, to train their pupils in Puritan and colonial values. Virginian colonists would have had similar views on humanity and children, but they would have been less concerned with transforming people into educated Christian citizens, since their society was more stratified and based on unfree labor. On the issue of higher education, the Puritan colonists of New England also established the first universities in what would become the continental United States. They founded Massachusetts Harvard College, later Harvard University, in 1636, and the Collegiate School, also known as Yale University, in 1701. These higher education institutions were established to help the New England colonies create a new, American-born Puritan political elite. In contrast, Virginia did not put an early emphasis on education like the New England colonies did. Though it was an older colony, Virginia did not establish its first college or university, the College of William and Mary, until 1693, over 50 years after Harvard opened its doors. Virginia's society was more unequal, with wealthy elite landowners, called the gentry, wanting to maintain power over their slaves, indentured servants, and poor, landless colonists. Consequently, Virginia was less interested in promoting education, as doing so would create a new elite class that would threaten the established colonial leadership. In our discussions of Virginia and New England, we have discussed two very different approaches the English people took to colonization. Later colonies would have critical similarities and differences with both of these two colonial societies, Virginia and New England. To this end, we will discuss two more colonial regional groups, the Mid-Atlantic and the Deep South. For the purpose of this class, we will consider the Mid-Atlantic colonies to be Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Although some people consider Maryland to be a southern colony, we will discuss it as a Mid-Atlantic colony. This is a map of the city of New Amsterdam, which was basically the capital of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. This is what it would have looked like shortly before the English took over New Netherland once and for all. Of course, they renamed the colony to New York, and they renamed New Amsterdam to New York City. This is De Heer Street, or Gentleman's Street as it was called by the Dutch. The English will ultimately rename it to Broadway because it was a very broad, very wide road. We actually think that De Heer Street may have been built over a Native American hunting path. Basically, one road was turned into another. And of course, this is Wall Street, called that because it's parallel to the wall. This is a canal that was put in by Governor Peter Stuyvesant. A bit more about him in a couple of minutes. And of course, it featured a fort to protect the colony from possible attacks. This is a 17th century engraving of New Amsterdam, which will soon become New York City. You can see the Dutch architecture. These are very, very tall, very narrow buildings. The Dutch preferred to build up rather than out. This is because of just land being at a premium in the Netherlands because so much of the country is below sea level. Also, for taxation purposes, the Dutch chose to build up rather than out. And they kept this tradition even after they arrived in the colonies. They also kept up their tradition of having what are called stepped gables. You can see the stepped gables here. It was an aesthetic choice. I've also been told, too, that these step gables were for practical uses as well. It made it easier for the Dutch to get up to clean their roofs and to basically do maintenance and things like that on their buildings. So you're seeing some of these Dutch traditions from Europe being used even in the Americas where they're not as necessary, but cultural ideas will continue. This is another older engraving of the Dutch settlement at New Amsterdam. You can see there are very bright, very vibrant colors being used to paint their homes. You also, in the foreground, can see a scaffolding for a gallows. So there are limits to the Dutch concept of tolerance. On the whole, the Dutch were some of the most tolerant people when it came to religion, and even in some ways when it came to ethnicity. Former slaves had opportunities in the Dutch colonies that they wouldn't have had elsewhere. But there are limits to how tolerant the Dutch could be, which is actually going to lead us into our discussion, a very brief discussion of Peter Stuyvesant, who is the last governor of the Dutch colonies before the English took over once and for all. This is Peter Stuyvesant. He was the last governor of New Netherland. He had a leg amputated because of wounds he sustained during a war, and people made jokes about his name because of his prosthetic leg. I'm not going to repeat what they called him. You can look that up for yourself if you'd like. But Governor Stuyvesant, on the positive side, he worked to build up New Amsterdam to get them better infrastructure. On the negative side, though, he was actually a lot less religiously tolerant than other Dutch leaders had been. He was not as tolerant of people who were not members of the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the largest and most powerful of the Dutch churches. If you were Catholic, if you were a Quaker, you would have had trouble when Governor Stuyvesant was in charge, which this actually angered a lot of the business class that basically helped rule the colony alongside the governor. They were called the burghers, not like what you eat, Burghers. Basically, they were upper class business leaders that ruled the colony. They actually opposed Governor Stuyvesant, making the colony less religiously tolerant. The burghers, their biggest focus was on commerce and business, and you have to be tolerant of people if you want to have good business relations with them. In the end, though, the English do take over the Dutch colony of New Netherland, and Governor Stuyvesant, he will negotiate with the British, or the English technically, to ensure that the Dutch colonists will have religious toleration. So once he's losing his power, he actually becomes a proponent of religious tolerance. The Maryland colony was founded in 1634 by George Calvert, Baron of Baltimore. Calvert was a Catholic, and he wanted to establish a safe haven in America for English Catholics, especially from the upper class, who had lost their noble titles due to their faith. King Charles I, successor of James I, was sympathetic to Catholics and allowed the Calverts to go forward with the formation of their colony, which they would establish just to the north of Virginia. The colony was religiously tolerant in the beginning, but the Calverts intended the colony's leadership to be Catholic, even if most of the lower class colonists in Maryland were actually going to be Protestants. In 1649, Maryland legally codified its toleration of all Christians, Catholic and Protestant, although Catholics would continue to rule the colony. This is a very idealized 19th century painting of the founding of the Maryland colony in 1634. The paperwork to set up the colony was being completed as early as 1632, and then the colonists arrived in 1634. It's believed that these Maryland Catholic colonists had the first Catholic Mass in the English American colonies. Of course, the Spanish and the French would have had Catholic Masses in their colonies much earlier, but the English were primarily a Protestant power when it came to colonization, so you wouldn't have seen a Catholic Mass going on openly and in public in a place like Jamestown, Virginia, or Plymouth, or Boston, Massachusetts Bay. But in Maryland, a colony that was set up for Catholics, of course they're going to have a Catholic Mass early on in their colony. Maryland was a desirable place to settle for both Catholics and Protestants. The colony awarded free land to immigrant colonists, called head rights. The soil was rich with nutrients, and the growing season was long, making tobacco the colony's principal agricultural output, like Virginia. Unfortunately, the colony's rapid growth led to a series of wars with Native Americans, much like Jamestown's conflict with the Powhatan people, and the New England colony's struggle with the Pequots. The Maryland colony took its name from Charles I's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, a Catholic French princess. Although it was named after an English queen, Maryland was not established as a royal colony, ruled directly by the monarch. Rather, it was a proprietary colony, ruled by an intermediary, the Calvert family, who were not elected by the colonists. In contrast, Virginia and other New England settlements were founded as corporate colonies, founded and funded by groups of individuals, and the colonists had more say in who their leaders were, with the New England colonists having the most say, and the Jamestown, Virginia colonists having a little bit less control over who their leadership was, but still more of a say in the running of their colony than the Maryland colonists. Over time, as the Maryland colony grew, it became more like its southern neighbor, Virginia. Intended to be a safe haven for Catholics, the colony allowed for a degree of religious toleration. The colony's leadership, however, was exclusively Catholic, ruling over a predominantly Protestant settler class. The Protestant settlers, especially the Puritan settlers, felt that the Catholic elite did not properly represent them, since Protestants could not become rulers of the proprietary colony. Consequently, in 1689, a Protestant army, consisting mostly of Puritans, took over the colony, removing the proprietary leadership. In order to prevent future Catholic rule, the Protestants made being Catholic illegal in 1704. Religious toleration would not be restored in Maryland until after the American Revolution. While they had removed Maryland's laws of religious toleration, the colony's Protestant settlers believed that they were actually ensuring religious freedom for themselves, the Protestant majority, by making sure that the colonial leadership had the same beliefs as the people. This is a period illustration of enslaved Africans at work collecting tobacco for white slave owners. Tobacco was a major industry in the colony of Maryland. This is another 16th century or somewhat of a period image of wheat harvesters at work. As you move away from the coast into the more temperate, mountainous regions of Maryland, you see less tobacco agriculture and more food crop agriculture. This is an image of the Mason-Dixon line, established in the 1760s to clearly demarcate the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, as both colonies were claiming each other's territory as their own. For many years, and even to this day, the Mason-Dixon line is seen as being a border demarcator between the North and the South, so-called. I don't think that colonists in colonial times would have seen it that way, because both Maryland and Pennsylvania initially allowed slavery. It's something that would have come up after the Revolutionary War, as northern states like Pennsylvania begin to abolish slavery, while states like Maryland, which in colonial times are more like a mid-Atlantic colony, Maryland becomes more like a southern colony as slavery becomes a bigger part of its economy and culture. And even to this day, people use the Mason-Dixon line as a demarcating line between the North and the South. A southern person, even if they're from Louisiana or Mississippi, might say, I'm from south of the Mason-Dixon line, as a way of saying they're from the South, even though the Mason-Dixon line is really on the East Coast, east of the Appalachian Mountains. Further to the north, another group of religious dissidents, called the Quakers, established a colony in Pennsylvania in 1681. Pennsylvania took its name from its leader, William Penn, a Quaker from England. Quakers, officially known as the Religious Society of Friends, were a Protestant religious sect that began in the wake of the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651. The Quakers were founded by George Fox and Margaret Fell. Both Fox and Fell believed that the Church of England and the Puritans had become corrupt and violent, as evinced by the acrimonious English Civil War, in which Anglican Royalist Cavaliers fought the Puritan parliamentarian Roundheads for control of the country. The Puritans had executed King Charles I, whom we discussed before, and temporarily removed the English monarchy, making Oliver Cromwell the leader and Lord Protector of England. The Quakers rejected both sides during the Civil War and preached the values of nonviolence, pacifism, and abstention from worldly pursuits and indulgences, like the abuse of tobacco and alcohol, and even the consumption of spicy food. Penn's colony would be established on these principles. Quaker religious services, both in England and in Pennsylvania, allowed all attendees, including women, to testify, that is, speak before the congregation. The Quakers believed that all people had an inner light, and thus should be able to speak about spiritual matters for themselves, regardless of their gender. The Quakers showed a remarkable amount of gender egalitarianism by the standards of the day. Wanting to flee persecution, Penn and his Quakers established the settlement of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, in 1682. Because of their commitment to pacifism, the Quakers preferred to trade with Native Americans or buy land from them, rather than taking land by force or defending their incursions through warfare, as was done in other colonies. Pennsylvania, like Maryland, was a proprietary colony, but its government was more democratic and representative, consisting of elected county commissioners who represented the people who voted for them. This political innovation, combined with the colony's religious toleration, made Pennsylvania, quote, the best poor man's country, in the words of contemporaries. English colonists from a variety of backgrounds migrated to Pennsylvania due to its pull factors of peace with Native Americans, religious toleration, and representative government. Even colonists from outside of England and the English colonies, like Germany, settled in Pennsylvania. So far, I've been very positive in my coverage of the Quakers. They were committed to pacifism and nonviolence. They did have a relatively egalitarian colony, and on the whole, there was more peace between the Pennsylvanian colonists and the Native Americans in the region, at least the Pennsylvania Quaker colonists. In future videos, you're going to see that other Pennsylvanians were far less peaceful. But there are limits to Quaker tolerance. On the previous slide, I didn't mention it in my voiceover, but in the lecture notes, I mentioned the walking purchase, in which basically through fraudulent terms, the Quakers of Pennsylvania purchased a large tract of land from the Delaware people. Now, basically what they did was they made an agreement, supposedly with the Delaware, that they would be able to buy as much land as a man could walk over in a day and a half. And what happened was the Quakers and the Delaware agreed to this, and then the Quakers sent out their best distance runner to walk the territory that they would claim. And they did things like clear away the path for him, and obviously he was not a regular person. And the Native Americans expected to probably sell perhaps 30 square miles of territory in what is now eastern Pennsylvania, and he ended up selling, or being rather forced to sell, over 100 square miles because this man walked a lot further than they expected. And it led to increased mistrust of white Euro-American people, which is very understandable. It led to other Native American stories and proverbs like don't make deals with white men when they want to buy land. You can tell them they can have as much land as will be covered by a cow's skin, and the white man will take the cow skin and cut it into small strips and then claim land that's, several acres in length. Or you can't tell the white man that they can only buy land that's covered by a wicker chair, because the white man will take the wicker chair apart and attach all the wicker together to claim, a large tract of land. So it leads to increased mistrust. The Quakers may not have been openly violent, but they did act in a fraudulent manner. The Quakers also were very large slave traders. They do eventually become abolitionists, but they were slave traders before this. Probably the most interesting and craziest instance of Quaker intolerance, though, comes in the story of the Jersey Devil. And I thought I would mention this story because students always ask me to share more creepy and spooky stuff when I'm doing my class. So in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the Quakers began moving out of Pennsylvania and eastward into what is now New Jersey, into the Piney Woods region in the southern part of Jersey. The Quakers did not like the Anglican or Church of England loyal settlers that they encountered in the region. The Quakers did not like the Church of England. It was too showy. They thought of it as being too much like the Catholic Church, and even being occult, too mystical for them. And also, a lot of the settlers in the region were more loyal to the King of England than the Quakers were. The Quakers had been persecuted back in England. They had very little reason to like the King of England, whereas the Anglican settlers of New Jersey were more likely to like the king. One of the most prominent families in the region was the Leeds family, and they basically went on to the Anglican loyal to the English crown side of things. The Leeds family were surveyors, but they also published almanacs, and some of these almanacs are believed to have had basically things like astrology in them, stuff that Quakers would have seen as being occult and pagan even. So they don't trust the Leeds family for being Anglican. They don't like these almanacs they're printing. It's seen as being not Quaker and not Christian. And the irony in colonial America is people who are marginalized, people who are persecuted, the Puritans were persecuted back in England. Once they get into power in the American colonies, they begin to persecute others. The same thing with the Puritans when they take over England. After the English Civil War, they go from being persecuted to persecutor. And unfortunately, the Quakers will do that as well in New Jersey. They may have been tolerant in Pennsylvania, but New Jersey was another story. And this whole issue with the Leeds family and with almanacs was really in some ways blown up by a young printer named Benjamin Franklin, who was not a Quaker and not a superstitious person by any stretch of the imagination. He was basically at this point in his life, he was a deist if you read his autobiography. He actually kind of exaggerated the story. That way he could sell more of his own almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac it was called. So all of these strange legends and ghost stories began to prop up that Daniel Leeds haunted the woods of South New Jersey as a ghost, that Mother Leeds, one of the women in the family, gave birth to a demonic entity that had wings and hooves, and then flew out of her home and into the night and would haunt people. And then the image on this slide is a early 20th century depiction of the Jersey Devil, the supposed spawn of Mother Leeds, that occult Anglican family that wouldn't bow to the will of the Quaker settlers in New Jersey. So there's a lot of things that we can congratulate the Quakers for setting up a more tolerant colony in Pennsylvania, for being more committed to nonviolence than other English colonists, but there are limits to their tolerance. Things like the fraudulent walking purchase, their engagement in the slave trade, and then how they interacted with the colonists of New Jersey as seen through the mystical Jersey Devil story. The settlements of Delaware, New Jersey, and New York were not established by the English, but they would become part of England's colonial empire through war and annexation. The Dutch established a colony in the Delaware Valley region in 1631, although all of the colonists were killed in a dispute with Native Americans. In 1638, more Dutch, along with Swedish and Finnish colonists, established permanent settlements in the region, founding Fort Christina on the Delaware River Valley near present-day Wilmington, Delaware. The Dutch of New Netherland would take over the Delaware colony in 1655, and the English would seize control of Delaware in 1664, with Maryland and Pennsylvania sharing control of the colony. Delaware colonists grew tobacco as a cash crop. To this end, Delaware planters imported indentured servants and slaves to work in the fields of their plantations. It is also worth noting that Delaware was the site of the first log cabins, which were introduced to the Americas by Scandinavian colonists. New Jersey and New York, originally New Netherland, were colonies established by the Dutch as well. We discussed their origins in a previous video. New Netherland was ruled from the settlement of New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, specifically Manhattan. The English captured the Dutch settlement and renamed the rest of the colony to New York after their own Duke of York, the future James II. We will talk about King James II in a future video. Although these colonies were not established by the English, they would be ruled as proprietary colonies, with England's governing monarch giving control of these territories to English noblemen. England took control of New Jersey, formerly New Sweden, in 1664 as well. Like Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent Maryland, Delaware, New York, and New Jersey were religiously and ethnically diverse. Following the Dutch pluralistic tradition, Christians of all sects were allowed to settle in these colonies. These colonies saw initial migration from Europe, but much of the colony's later immigrants came from other English colonies, especially New England, as religious dissidents fled the censure of the Puritans. Also, like the Dutch, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York would emphasize trade and commerce, causing settlements like New York City to quickly grow into large and important urban centers. These colonies would also import indentured servants and slaves to satisfy their labor needs. These are some images related to the early Delaware colony. On the right is Fort Christina, the Swedish settlement in Delaware that was eventually taken over by the Dutch and ultimately, in the end, taken over by the English. The other image on the left is of a farm in the Delaware Valley. This is to give you an idea of what the economy was like in Delaware. Delaware had slavery and plantations, but as you move further away from the coast, you start to see more small farms that are engaging in food crop agriculture. This is an engraving of Swedish colonists at work harvesting wheat near Fort Christina. Delaware had both food crop agriculture and cash crop agriculture, in which enslaved people provided the labor. This is an engraving, it's believed to be of the first Swedish colonists arriving in Delaware. Ultimately, the English, in the end, will take over Delaware. The Dutch did that before them. This is a non-contemporary image of settlers building log cabins. Many people don't know this, but the Swedish colonists were actually the first people to build log cabins in America. The English didn't build them. It was the Swedish who built them, and then this style of architecture became very popular with Western settlers, regardless of their ethnicity. And actually, believe it or not, some Native Americans began building log cabins in this Scandinavian style, but it was the Swedish who introduced this construction method to America. The Mid-Atlantic colonies had some key similarities, but also some important differences with the original English colonies in Virginia and New England. Southern Mid-Atlantic colonies, like Delaware and Maryland, had similar economic and labor structures to Virginia, growing cash crops like tobacco, forcing them to rely on unfree labor. Northern Mid-Atlantic colonies, like New Jersey and New York, were ethnically and religiously diverse, unlike Virginia and New England, having been initially established by the pluralistic Dutch. Pennsylvania was a religiously tolerant colony established by English Quakers, and its county commissioner system made the colony more like New England to the north, though, rather than proprietary colonies in the Mid-Atlantic, which were initially ruled by wealthy English noblemen. All in all, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, like their people, were very diverse, having incredibly varied political, social, and economic structures based on their environments and their demographics. Lastly, we must consider England's southern settlements, what would become the colonies of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. These colonies were not corporately or proprietarily established. Rather, they were royal colonies set up by the decree of the English monarch. Now we'll begin our discussion of the southern colonies, not including Virginia. North Carolina and South Carolina were originally a proprietary colony called Carolina, named after King Charles I. It was a single colony, much larger than the current states of North Carolina and South Carolina. This happened in 1629, but the area was not really settled until the 1660s and 1670s during the reign of King Charles II, at which point it was changed to Carolina, a more familiar name. Unlike some of the colonies discussed previously, which were charter and corporate colonies like Virginia and the Plymouth colony, Carolina and then Carolina was a proprietary colony. Although Carolina will eventually split into two colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. And by the time that they come into the British Empire as separate colonies, they actually come in as royal colonies. This is because the English and eventually the British are trying to centralize their empire, trying to flex imperial and monarchic might across the colonies. So you go from very decentralized corporate charter colonies, less decentralized proprietary colonies, set up by wealthy families with support of the king, and then ultimately royal colonies where the colonies come in with a governor appointed by the king. And that's basically exactly what happens with Carolina. It starts out as a single proprietary colony. As time goes on, as it grows, it breaks the two colonies, which come in as royal colonies. In 1670, English settlers from the Caribbean island of Barbados built the settlement of Charlestown in what will become South Carolina. South Carolina was different from the other English colonies because it was a slavery-based society from its creation. The Barbadian Englishmen who came to South Carolina brought African slaves with them to the American mainland, establishing plantations along the Carolina coast. They also purchased more slaves directly from Africa once they had arrived in North America. Instead of tobacco, these early South Carolinian plantations introduced two crops: indigo, a plant used to make blue dye, and rice. They also grew small amounts of cotton, but this plant would not become a viable cash crop until the late 1700s, after the creation of the United States. South Carolina's warm, subtropical environment made it a natural breeding ground for mosquitoes, which spread diseases like malaria and yellow fever. African slaves tended to have immunity to these diseases, since these pathogens originated in Africa, but Europeans and Native Americans did not. Consequently, few European settlers migrated to coastal South Carolina, and many of the colony's white elite lived in more northern colonies or inland, managing their plantations in absentia. As a result, South Carolina became a black majority colony by 1720, with most of its residents being slaves, in addition to a small, free African American population. Because of South Carolina's small white population, Africans, enslaved and free, were able to maintain far more elements of their African culture, because their white masters lived far away and were not trying to acculturate them to European lifeways. As an aside, English settlers in South Carolina also tried to enslave Native Americans that owed them debts, provoking the Yamasee War of 1715 through 1716. Enslaved Africans on the South Carolina coast mixed a variety of elements of African culture together to create the Gullah culture of the Carolina Low Country. Scholars call this type of cultural mixing creolization. Because of its plantation agricultural system, its reliance on slave labor, and its black demographic majority, many scholars argue that South Carolina was far more like the English colonial holdings in the Caribbean than it was like England's other American colonies. It should also be noted that western North Carolina, its inland mountain regions, developed differently from the colony's coastal settlements, being settled primarily by white, Scotch-Irish, and German settlers. Although the colony as a whole had a black majority, inland South Carolina's economy was not dependent on slavery, being comprised of small subsistence farmers called yeomen. North Carolina came about differently than its southern neighbor. Although it had been temporarily settled by the English in the 1500s, discussed in a previous video, English colonists did not migrate to the land that would become North Carolina until about 1663, with the establishment of the Albemarle settlements. Most of the first settlers who came to the colony actually migrated from Virginia rather than Europe.
Coastal North Carolina's demographics and labor systems were more like that of Virginia than South Carolina, as the state primarily grew tobacco rather than rice and indigo. The state also adopted race-based chattel slavery over time, rather than from its outset. Western North Carolina, with its rugged mountains and valleys, would be settled by German and Scotch-Irish settlers, who migrated southward down the Appalachian mountain range to establish small farms rather than large plantations. North Carolina as a whole would also remain lightly populated, making its coast a safe harbor for pirates like Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Essentially, you can think of North Carolina as being like Virginia on the coast, but like inland South Carolina in its mountainous uplands.
Now we'll discuss Georgia, the last of the English colonies founded in what would become the United States, the last of the 13 colonies. It was founded from 1732 to 1733 by James Oglethorpe under the orders of King George II. It's technically a proprietary colony, but in many ways it's functioning a lot more like a royal colony, even from its start. And it officially becomes a royal colony in 1751. Its first settlement was Savannah, which you can see on this slide. Georgia was meant to be a very utopian place. It was meant to be a place for poor, landless white people from England to go where they would have a better life. Slavery was banned in Georgia in the beginning. Poor whites would have land and would provide the labor for the colony. The colony also had a more pragmatic purpose as well. It was intended to serve as a military buffer zone between the English colonies in the Carolinas and Virginia and Spanish Florida. The Spanish and the English, or the British, will fight several wars against each other in the early 18th century. And it was very important that the British be able to protect their colonies further to the north.
Georgia was established for two reasons. First, the English intended to use Georgia as a buffer territory between the lucrative Carolina and Georgia colonies and hostile Spanish Florida to the south. The colony accomplished this goal, stopping a northward Spanish invasion in 1742 during the War of Jenkins' Ear. Georgia was established to be a safe haven for the poor of the British Isles. Oglethorpe, the governor, hoped that anyone who was too poor to live in Britain would migrate to Georgia, be they English, Welsh, Scottish, or even Irish. In Georgia, they would find land and labor. To this end, slavery was initially banned from Georgia, as the colony was intended to employ poor whites, rather than rely on the enslaved labor of Africans. In 1751, the British Crown gained direct control of Georgia and legalized slavery. With the legalization of slavery, coastal plantation owners began to import enslaved Africans, creating a labor and cultural system that was very similar to that of the South Carolina coast. Georgia's rugged backcountry was settled in much the same way as North and South Carolina's mountainous regions, by Scotch-Irish settlers and immigrants from other Anglo-American colonies. As was the case in most English colonies, the westward encroachment of Europeans provoked wars with Native Americans.
We covered a lot of material in this lecture video, so I'm going to conclude by summing up the points that I made. In New England, religion was a part of the founding of many of the colonies, especially Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, and Connecticut and Rhode Island. It was less of a factor in New Hampshire and Maine, but those areas were taken over by Massachusetts Bay. On the whole, New England was a very egalitarian and very democratic place. There was less unfree labor. There was a lot of upward economic mobility, less wealth inequality than other areas, and a relative amount of democracy if you were the right religion. If you were a Puritan in Massachusetts Bay or Connecticut, you would have political rights if you were a Puritan and male. Um, in the mid-Atlantic colonies, there's a lot of ethnic and religious and economic diversity because you have English colonies set up in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, but you also have Dutch colonies and even a small Swedish colony in Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. And a lot of those non-English traditions will continue on even after the English takeover. The colonies that were set up by the English in the mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, and Maryland were proprietary colonies. This is a move away from the older corporate charter colony model as the English or British Empire gets more centralized and takes more of a role in the establishment and ruling of the colonies with time. There's also slavery in the mid-Atlantic, especially in Maryland, but it's even present in colonies further to the north, although it's not a major part of the economy in the more northern mid-Atlantic colonies, but it is important in Maryland and also in Delaware as well. Further to the south, we have the southern colonies, not including Virginia. These are the Carolinas and Georgia. The Carolinas were originally one proprietary colony that split into two royal colonies, and the two colonies of North Carolina and South Carolina came into their own as royal colonies, again reflecting that increased centralization from corporate charter colonies, proprietary colonies, and then royal colonies being the most centralized. And Georgia was the last of the 13 colonies to be founded. It was technically a proprietary colony from its start, but really it was basically a royal colony even from the beginning, but by the 1750s it was a full royal colony. And Georgia initially did not allow slavery, but it allowed slavery with time. And in these southern colonies, you see a lot of plantation slavery on the coast, but you see a lot less slavery in the mountainous backcountry. In the mountainous backcountry, you see a lot more small farmers called yeoman farmers, many of whom are Scotch-Irish people. And these are the English colonies of North America that will go on to become the 13 colonies that will fight against Great Britain in the Revolutionary War.